I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Franklin Abbott is here with us this morning. He's a longtime friend of First Existentialist and a renowned psychotherapist, writer, poet, artist, and gay activist. We're lucky to have him here this morning to say a few words about a few poems in honor of National Poetry Month. Please help me welcome Franklin Abbott back to First.
Give me a minute to set myself up here. It's hard for me to talk about poetry without having. But I'm happy to be here as always.
You need to get closer to the microphone.
Okay, I will. I'm just digging in a book bag. All right. So good morning, and if I veer away from the microphone, kind of put your hands on your ears and let me know, and I'll come back. This is National Poetry Month. It is every April. I don't know why. There's a lot about poetry that I don't particularly understand. I don't have a degree in English or fine arts or anything like that. I just, loved poetry from the time I was in college. I think that's where, it began to speak back to me. Now, I thought about how poetry works in our lives, and poetry is a strange thing. I mean, you can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't wear it. It would fall into the category of useless if it didn't have uses. And we'll talk about some of those uses. But we all carry poetry inside us, and it'll start to make sense a little bit when you think about the poems that you've been carrying around in your psyche somewhere, for a very long time. And everybody's experience is different, okay? So there may be people for whom there would be different sort of bodies of work that they carry around inside them. But when I thought about it, I thought that there were really two things that I remember from being a little boy, really before I could much read, I could still memorize. And the things that I would remember would be nursery rhymes and Bible verses. Fortunately, more nursery rhymes than Bible verses. I didn't grow up in a very religious family, but we did believe in Mother Goose. So in thinking about it, I thought, well, when was the last time you read a nursery rhyme? One of the things that, I challenge myself on, as well as others, is to read poetry regularly, not only to read it with your eyes, but to read it out loud so you can hear it. Because the combination of the sound and the image is where the potency is, I believe. So anyway, I went and I looked up some Mother Goose poems, and how about Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Now, I have a fantasy that goes with that. I'm not going to articulate right now who Humpty Dumpty might be. But they kind of look alike. And then I'll give you this one because it caught my attention, and it ends with a mystery that maybe we can resolve. Probably not. It's probably unresolvable mystery. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Where did they go? Where are the spoon and the dish? So just allow that to marinate for a little bit. So, you know, the poetry that I was exposed to as a kid, because I didn't grow up in a literary family or a very literary part of the world, were simply those things. It was Bible verses and nursery rhymes. And then I went to school, and of course in elementary school, you know, there are a lot of little sing-songy poems that teachers read to students, but nothing really stood out to me. Maybe Dr. Seuss, something like that, a little bit more sophisticated than a nursery rhyme. And then I went to high school, and in high school, poetry was seen as sort of a revenge sport by English teachers. You know, they had an unwilling group of people usually. Anyway, people are very rarely enthusiastic about a survey of American literature when they're teenagers. But so the poetry was something that it seemed like they took pleasure in kind of grinding it in a certain way. And I have two memories. One is of Miss Latimer, and Miss Latimer was one of the last old maid school teachers. You know, she was a spinster, and she dressed in clothes that were at least 2 decades old, and her hairstyle was, you know, really from the 50s or the 40s, and she was a very strong physical presence because she was as round as she was tall. She was just a circular being, and she had a great intensity about her. And the poem that she read to us, and she read it several times, and I had not visited it, you know, since high school, was Casey at the Bat. Now, does anybody know who wrote Casey at the Bat? Any guesses out there? It was Ernest Lawrence Thayer who wrote it in 1883. I don't think he ever wrote another poem, but this one was popular in terms of performance. Poetry was performed a great deal before we had movies and television and that sort of thing. People would memorize and recite poems. I still know some people who were brought up in the sort of British boarding school traditions who know tons of poetry that they can speak by heart. But Casey at the Bat was not a part of literature that, you know, one would study necessarily, but Miss Latimer liked to read it, and she had memorized it because she got to swing the bat. You know, and she always had a magic bat that she brought to swing. I will not read the entire poem to you, but let me just start you out. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 4-2, but 1 inning more to play. And then when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a pall-like silence fell upon the patrons of the game. You can hear the suspense build. So this did very little for our you know, creative minds, our love of poetry, and thanks to Miss Latimer and her vivid presentation of it, I have a memory. The other, I cannot remember the teacher who came after her. She was a little bit more progressed. She was an older lady who had been teaching English for a very, very long time, and I believe was, you know, kind of waiting for her retirement. And she liked to torment us. Now, these are 16-year-olds that are dealing with puberty and rock and roll and all this, that, and the other. Her favorite thing was to bring out Milton, and right after lunch, you know. And here's just a little bit of Milton, because I don't want to put any of us to sleep right now. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal task brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and again the blissful seat, sing heavenly muse, date on that secret top of Horeb or Sinai didst inspire. There's still not a period, you know. And it goes on like that, I think, for a very, very long time. So, let me talk to you about the two reasons I think that poetry matters, why it has persisted in our history, why it's significant in our lives. One is that poetry is a great way to memorize something. And in the ancient world, many people could not read. And many people who would be the bards, you know, who would go around and share the stories and that sort of thing, would not be literate. They would be reciting. It's interesting that one of our longest recitation poems, and they're almost always about genealogy or the king winning a battle. Those are the two major themes of who begat who, or who triumphed over who. You know that the Iliad, which is one of our cherished classics, was written by Homer, who was blind. So Homer was writing by sound. So it's when you look at a lot of poetry, it is about a list of things. And this is true in many, many different places. I wanted to read you a Genesis list. It's a shorter one than the one that is in the Christian Bible. This is from the Cato Communions. Water went, they say, land was not, they say. Water only then, mountains were not, they say. Stones were not, they say. Fish were not, they say. Deer were not, they say. Grizzlies were not, they say. Panthers were not, they say. Wolves were not, they say. People were washed away, that they say. Grizzlies were washed away, they say. Panthers were washed away, they say. Deer were washed away, they say. Coyotes were not then, they say. Ravens were not, they say. Herons were not, they say. Woodpeckers were not, they say. Then wrens were not, they say. Then hummingbirds were not, they say. Then otters were not, they say. It goes on. But it gives you a sense of that list poem that is very important in terms of telling stories. And so the other reason, and this is more esoteric and fun, and it's also fun to be a retired professional and not worry about what I say. When I talk about these things, we can just have fun with it. So the other use of poetry is incantation. It's enchanted. Literally, a chant is a song. A poem, can be an incantation. It can be something that is done for magical reasons. And that's a whole different story for another day, in terms of what magic is, how it works in the imagination. But much of what we use in poetry, is in a sense an incantation. Let me share another one with you. This is from India, from the Veda people. It's called mantra for binding a witch. And if you don't know that terminology, binding means doing something that stops them. That the witch is up to no good, and so you're doing a ritual to stop the witch who's done the ritual. So it's a counter ritual. I bind the sharp end of a knife. I bind the glowworm in the forehead. I bind the magic of 900 guru. I bind the familiars of 900 witches. I bind the fairies of the sky. Let the sky turn upside down. Let the earth be overturned. Let the horns grow on horse and ass. Let mustaches sprout on young girl. Let the dry cow dung sink and the stones float. But let this charm not fail. So, that's poetry, So for a long time, poets were thought to have special powers, and they do. But probably, we're just a little bit better at writing inside the birthday card. That would be the special power. Or to write so illegibly, you can't tell what was written. But there's a myth that I was taken by that was explained in a poem by Anne Hartigan. And Anne Hartigan was a famous Irish poet and playwright who died a few years ago, a very interesting writer. And her poem Long Tongue is a description of two things. One is that in the old folklore of Ireland, it was believed that if you were a poet, and of course poets have these magical powers, that you had an especially long tongue. So that's one way you could tell a poet, is that they had that long tongue. And that if a woman had a long tongue, that was twice as dangerous. And maybe that's true. I know some very wise women. Here's Anne's poem, Long Tongue. If, as the old ones say, none is as poison as I, that my long tongue can pierce more death, brew more potent words, make rats remember or forget, swirl the bucket, pudding spoon the sailor, stir him to his doom. And yet, if wish could do, what spawned this twice deceiving gift, did I feed off like serpent flesh, or press small teeth to the sweet salmon's neck, suck the tip while milk from sunstruck fairy cow? Can my cipher push beneath the floor, keep dancers' feet pattering more, more, more? The death beat shreds life. With a beheading howl curdles the spirit in a drunken speech. Press the vein, the word, cries cease. Do I carry dark blame and sorrow double deep? Because I sing a woman's song, so therefore must I weep. Long tongue and heart. Okay, let me do just a little bit of talking more about poets. There really are two kinds. There are the ones that have the sort of reputation that Anne Hartigan talks about that kind of fosters some swagger and that kind of things. We love a bad poet. We love, somebody who, has gone off and done crazy things and written all about it. But we love the good poets too. And so there's a way in which we can turn a poet into, a saint, treat them in a certain way. I'll read a piece of a poem I wrote called Keats at 200, which I wrote on the 200th anniversary of the death of Keats. Because of proximity, I visited the Freud Museum. I saw the mother coach. couch and all of Sigmund's ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian statuettes. I visited the Keats house, where the divine poet had been a lodger before he went to Rome and died. He wrote Ode to a Nightingale there. I saw his death mask, the ring he offered to his beloved Fanny Braun. He wrote the ode in the garden while his cheek still glowed before tuberculosis sent him south to Rome to die young and beautiful. Keats was the prototype for James Dean and Jean-Michel Basquiat, Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix. Had they lived, would their magic have waned? Keats was only 25, born 200 years ago, and still alive. So, poets can live on. I wanted to read one more poem to you. Yeah, one more poem. Let's see if I can find it. I like to put little cards and things or markers because there's nothing like standing in front of a large group of people not being able to find page 14. So this is sort of an incantation poem, and sometimes we write these poems because we want to remember something that happened that was important for us, so that when I read this poem, the person I can re-enchant is myself, because I was there. And probably many of us have had a similar experience, out there in nature somewhere. It's called A Canyon is a Cradle. A canyon is a cradle for the breath of the earth and wind. The wind knows everything from the rings of Saturn to the surface of the water. The ancient ones knew the wind was shaman and friend. They built drawers for the wind in their houses. They listened to the wind whistle in the rocks. They rounded their temples as if to ask the wind to stay longer, to blow clear and soft, to tell them of the far away and tell them of the close at hand. In Chaco Canyon, between cliffs, the colors of osier and burnt umber, the ancient ones are gone, and gone are their successors, and what only knows where is the breath of the earth, the wind that was there and remains. So thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm going to leave my pile of stuff up